Hello, everybody. Today we have another monthly session of our Decision Camp. And today our presenter is Nick Broom. Nick is a well-known decision modeling practitioner who started still with ZDM, the decision model, and then actively used DMN. And what I always like when I talk to Nick or read his post, is that he brings what I call a view from trenches, because he actually using different methodology and different tools. And so his experience from trenches is really valuable. And today he will talk about decision modeling in an agile environment. And I'm looking forward to hear. Nick, take over.
Thanks for that, Jacob. Okay, hello, everybody. So yeah, practical decision modeling in an agile environment. So what you can expect to get from today is an understanding of how executable decision modeling fits as part of developing a valuable product using agile principles and practices. So that's what I'm aiming for you to understand by the end of it. So just a little bit about me. I'm an independent consultant for the moment, at least. I've worked in financial services, legal, healthcare, logistics, media, and I'm currently in oil and gas. So I've been around a bit. I've been doing agile projects for over 10 years, and I've done that in a variety of guises. So I've done the product owner and scrum master scrum roles. I've been a business analyst as part of a scrum team. And I've also been, a more general agile coach and a head of agile transformation. I've been doing decision modeling since 2010. Jacob mentioned that I started off using TDM, which is the decision model, and I've kind of been in and around DMN since its inception. And I have actually worked with decision model implementations at a couple of major financial institutions. And then finally, I am a certified professional Scrum Master as well from scrum.org. So hopefully I know a little bit about Agile. So in terms of what we're going to look at today, I'm going to talk a lot about, as much as this is focused on decision modeling in an agile environment, there's going to be an awful lot of focus on the agile part of this. So I'm going to talk about a bit about user stories and job stories and how they fit in with decision modeling and how we use techniques like user story mapping. I'm also going to look at the definition of value. So what I mean by that is the definition of value when it comes to value in a user story versus a minimum viable product. What I'm then going to do is look at user story acceptance criteria, and I'm actually going to talk about Gherkin scenarios as well, and I'll explain some of this terminology as we go through and how they can be used to help inform the decision logic that will get built. Then I'm going to show how decision modeling is typically just one contributing part to the value required in any given sprint. What it then means to deliver value early when you're doing decision modeling. And then we're also going to do a bit of a detailed overview on how you can apply refactoring techniques, particularly using things like business knowledge models within DMN. So I am theoretically going to show you how we can get from something like this, this is actually a real world decision requirements diagram, but the big caveat here is it is one that has been iterated over a number of times. So this is very much not quite end state, but it's pretty close. So there's still more iterations that can be done over the top of it. But ultimately, I'm looking to show how we can get to something like that in decision modeling terms from something that looks more like that when we're doing some requirements discovery through the use of user stories and how we visualize those in a story map. Okay, so what we won't cover, but like I say on the side, by all means, feel free to ask at the end if there's something on this list that you've actually got a burning question about. I'm not going to go into chapter and verse on the different Agile principles and practices. I'm not going to discuss the detailed decision logic that's actually in this model. I'll touch on bits of it, but by no means go into the whys and wherefores as to how I've structured it. And I'm not going to talk specifically in detail about the surrounding architecture that supports the implementation of the product to the end user. Again, I'll touch on it, but I'm not going into this stuff in any detail. Okay, disclaimers. So what I'm expressing today is my personal opinions based on my experience. So essentially, any resemblance to persons living or dead is entirely coincidental. And this is just one way of doing it. So what I'm not presenting this as the way of doing it in an Agile environment. I'm saying this is one way based on how my practice has evolved over the years. There will be things that people might think are absolutely bonkers. There might be things that people think there is a better way of doing it. So that's why I say this is just one way of doing it. But fundamentally, what I'm looking to do is present how do we deliver value to an end user, i.e. how do we take vertical slices through a given architecture to ensure that we're not just taking a component view of the world. So things before we get started then. So I'm going to make a number of assumptions. We're going to assume that the product that's being developed here is entirely new. So we're not iterating over anything that's already existing. It's a brand new development. And there's both UI elements to this as well as an API team, and it will be delivered using a Scrum team. And the other assumption is that this product will be based on delivering value within a 2-week sprint cadence. And I'm not going to make any distinction about roles. So there's a lot of debate sometimes around who does decision modeling. The key thing within a Scrum team is that a Scrum team is designed to have all of the skills necessary to deliver a valuable increment at the end of an iteration. So for me, it's about who's got the right skills to do those decision modeling, not is that person a data modeler, a business analyst, a business person. It is just somebody with the right skills. So I'm not going to make a distinction about that necessarily. Okay, so just a bit of a shout out to the various tools that have contributed to today's content. So I'm using the Tricytech Decision Modeler tool. That is my personal tool of choice. I'm using Atlassian Jira, which a lot of you may well have used for user story capture. I've used a plugin, well, 2 plugins to that. The first is from a company called Easy Agile, and they provide the user story maps plugin. And SmartBear provide a Cucumber plugin, which is used for Gherkin scenarios. So yeah, a lot of vegetable talk, but that will hopefully become clear as we go through it. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to talk about the business problem that we're dealing with. So this is actually an example from the logistics domain. So I know a lot of the examples in decision modeling are often finance related. So hopefully this is a bit of a breath of fresh air. But essentially the business problem that I'm going to talk about is if a client distributes physical products, so we buy those every day and even more so during lockdown, it's generally going to enter into an agreement with a logistics network. And that client's going to want to know whether they're actually getting value for money. So they're going to have a number of considerations like, what's the experience been like for the customer? Are the parcels arriving within the SLA that's been agreed? And therefore the basis of the money that I as a client am paying to that provider. So basically I'm going to start with one of those business questions that the client wants an answer to, which is, are my parcels meeting their speed of service target agreed with the provider? And I've expressed that in a user story format. So I've basically said, as a goods shipper, I want to know whether my parcels are meeting their speed of service target so that I know I'm getting the service I paid for from the logistics provider. So that's basically the problem that we're going to try and solve or look at today. So first of all, we need to actually be able to break that down. So how do we break down a problem like this in an agile way? So we need to, if we're delivering in using a Scrum team and we're delivering in a 2-week cadence, we need to be able to break that business problem down into chunks of value that can be delivered within a 2-week sprint. By focusing in that way, we can learn more quickly about whether we're delivering the right thing. So we are going to look at user stories and how there are splitting techniques involved with those that you can use to identify value so that you can deliver stuff in short cycles. And then I'll relate that to how we can do that in a decision modeling environment. So I'm going to go through a bit about user stories first off. A lot of people may already know this, but they're traditionally a way of describing what a user is trying to achieve with a piece of software. So Kent Beck, who created extreme programming, coined this term. And his whole idea was that if a user could tell a story about what they were trying to do, it was a far more meaningful way of expressing the value of that requirement. And they're typically expressed in the format as a person, a user role. I want some piece of functionality so that I get some defined benefit. Now, that actually came later. That wasn't part of the original concept of a user story. A user story was, I think when Ken Beck came up with it, the idea was that, you know, if you could just put some sort of narrative, that was meaningful enough. But this story format's kind of become the de facto standard for expressing stories. They're intended to be full stack. This is the thing, if I'm being honest, that most people new to Agile struggle with. So they're a thin slice through the whole of the system architecture. If it's written from the perspective of a true user, then the value is only realized when you actually implement all of the component parts required. So if you've got something that is going to be delivered through a UI, the chances are it needs that plus some web services, plus an underlying database, and potentially a whole load of other stuff. So delivering one aspect of that, in most cases, probably won't have value from an end user's point of view. And that's really what Agile is focused on doing. They're usually small enough to fit into a single sprint. That is typically 2 weeks. The Scrum guidance is actually that a single sprint should last no more than a month. And the Agile principle states, you know, deliver in the shorter time scale where you can. And this is quite important as well. They are a representation of a requirement. So they are intended to drive conversation and collaboration. They are not just another way of expressing a specification. They are, you know, they were designed to do on index cards. So the idea was you deliver the index, what's on the index card, and you chuck it away. When I first started doing Agile projects, Jira didn't even exist, if you can get your head around that. And then the last bit is that the acceptance criteria on that story tells us what needs to be true for that story to be considered done. So that's a quick whistle-stop tour through user stories. This is worth just a quick mention, user stories versus job stories. If anybody knows Mike Cohn, he's pretty much a guru when it comes to everything Scrum related. So I'm a big fan of his work. And his definition is that it's focused less on the user performing some function than on the job to be done by that story, which is really useful when it does come to decision modeling, because some of the lower level decisions that we might be looking to make are enablers for other decisions later on. So they're definitely business questions that need to be answered, but it might be a question that's answered for a whole set of people, or it might be that you need to get to that answer in order to answer the more important thing. So the only real difference in the format is that it's when a job's being performed, I want so that. So there's not a great deal of distinction, but it just helps focus the way you express the requirement. So how do we split that business problem in the first instance? So traditional thinking would be, well, that, you know, the speed of service, well, we can't break that down. There's no value to that unless you're able to answer that question. So we can't break that down. We can't do that in a 2-week sprint. Your user story will just have to go over more than one sprint. So this is one of the first times we need to differentiate the difference between what is valuable to a user and something that has functionality that we can start making money from. This is the thing that people can get quite tied up in. So if I look at what is value to a user versus what is a minimum product, for example, if I want to trigger a limiter for my car's speed, that's valuable for me as the driver of that car. The chances are the manufacturer's not going to release that as a whole, unless obviously they're selling the parts separately. They're going to wrap an entire car around it. So basically that is valuable to me, but that is the thing that actually represents in the manufacturer's instance the minimum viable product. So as a car driver, I want to be able to get a maximum, set a maximum speed limit for my car so that I don't have to keep checking if I'm within the allowed limit for the area I'm driving it. That's a good user story and it's valuable, but the product owner's not going to release that most likely until there's an entire car around it. So that's the key distinction that I would make between what value in a user story is versus what a minimum viable product might be. So how does decision modeling support our ability to break that kind of problem down? Well, a decision is typically looking to answer a question. So we're attempting to answer a business question because the answer will help us guide our subsequent actions. So tools like the Try2Tech Decision Modeler offer you the ability to enter the business question you're trying to answer and the possible allowed answers as part of the decision element when you add it to the diagram. So the question that we're looking to answer usually requires answers to other questions. So it requires, and I specifically use that word requires, and that'll become a bit clearer later on. But essentially, we can't answer this particular question without knowing things like where does the measurement for any given parcel start and end? What target are we trying to meet? Is the parcel just in the UK or is it everywhere? Is it every different type of service? So each of those questions has value in their own right. So we can break it down, but just because we break it down doesn't mean we're going to release it. So So to create smaller chunks of value, we can actually break those kinds of questions down by dimension. So what I mean by that is that. Sorry, it sounds like somebody else is actually on. If you can
somebody,
mute.
Let me mute all, but you.
So what I'm basically going to look at now, so if I take myself in the role as product owner, I've determined that we can realize value by focusing on the parcels clients care most about, which happens to be the next day service. And that also means I'm going to limit my focus to UK mainland because I'm in the UK. And I also want to focus on providing the information about just a specific parcel in the first instance, because if I know that, then if I know about a single parcel, I can aggregate it up to a higher level. And typically where people really care about whether something's about the speed of service, if it's gone wrong. So if it's gone wrong, you need to know information about that specific parcel. So that means that I'm going to break that question down in terms of not just, has it met its speed of service, but has a next day parcel met its speed of service? So the question, my MVP is going to be the capability for a user to determine the status for a next day service parcel. So that is just going to be one aspect. That's going to be one slice of that whole business problem. And hopefully for those people that are experienced in decision modeling, you probably already see how that kind of thing would start to break down. So this overall objective for me now is going to be the thing that forms my input to planning this with a Scrum team. So I'm going to talk a little bit about user story mapping. So I promise we'll get onto decision modeling, but it's this kind of gives you the view of all of the stuff that actually sits around decision modeling as one specific technique. So user story mapping is basically a technique for requirements discovery and prioritization. So it's a technique to map user stories in 2 dimensions, unless it turns a flat product backlog into a more visually engaging representation of the user journey. So horizontally, the idea is chronological order within a given theme to show how the user interacts with the product. And then vertically, it's talking about value. So this is basically saying the highest value stuff is at the top, and then as you go further down, it basically helps to say, right, I tell you what, as part of my minimum viable product, that's going to be my release 1. And then there's stuff I'm going to want soon after that, and then some stuff that can come later. So you start to build up that roadmap vertically. So I tend to look at this the horizontal way as building a product incrementally and the vertical as building it iteratively. And the reason that I say that is incrementally means that you are adding bits onto that user journey. So you can do one thing, and if you delivered that, maybe you'll deliver the next thing, and that will actually move that user journey on. So I always look at that as incremental versus iterative, where you are improving all of the things that a user can do in that particular space. So that doesn't mean, though, that just because this is a sequence, that flow dictates the sequence for developing the stories. For example, it'd be possible to deliver a story where all of the input data was mocked up to prove that a calculation produced the correct result, and that another story introduced later on refactors that calculation decision to require the output from another decision. So that's part of how you would refine the story backlog through discussion with the developers in the Scrum team. So this user story mapping exercise is great for doing overarching planning, and the chances are you will continue to iterate over this as you actually go through any of the sprints that the delivery team are working through. So how do I use story maps to facilitate decision modeling? So decision models are declarative, I hear everybody shout. So there's no sequence in it. Sequence is a dirty word when it comes to decision modeling. So whilst a DRD is directed, the direction represents that an element requires another. So that's why I mentioned requires specifically earlier on. So a DRD is a directed acyclic graph. So that's this is an example of, this is actually a very simplified initial version of what that eventual decision stemmed from. Story mapping is still very, very useful in this, because even when applied to decision modeling focused problems, you can actually use the horizontal chronology in standard terms to actually represent the direction of the information requirements. So that'll become clear as we go on. So some of you might say, well, hang on a minute, we've got this thing called a DRD in DMN, why wouldn't you go straight to that? So a story map enables us to visualize the work required to deliver the overarching value. It's simpler to collaborate on a story map. There are a number of methods to do that. There was a physical whiteboard when we were all allowed to still touch stuff. There are things like Miro, Lucidchart. You can do story mapping directly in Jira, which I'll show you in a minute. And a decision service, I'm going to use that term because I'm going to talk about executable stuff, is typically only one component in delivering value to that user. I've already talked previously about that vertical slice piece, but essentially that's why I wouldn't always just go straight to a DRD, because what I want to ensure is that in capturing what's needed to deliver value, the decision element of it is likely, not always, but likely to be one part of it. So I just wanted to talk a little bit, though, about common story splitting mistakes, because people might say, right, well, okay, this is all well and good, but actually, we might choose to do our decision models first, and then, we can do some of that other stuff later. So generally what people do is they will, in an attempt to make stories small enough to fit in a sprint, they split it by an architectural component. So the idea is we deliver, the data in sprint 1, services in sprint 2, UI in sprint 3. So we're doing this kind of stuff, which means that if you're working in a 2-week sprint cadence, actually you could be waiting at least 6 weeks before we deliver anything that an end user can get value from. And in this instance, I'm going to assume that a service on its own doesn't have value. There are instances in which, again, you could argue that if you provide an API, a particular external API, that definitely has value to a client that wants to consume it. But I'm just kind of talking about the common mistakes that tend to be made. So do not do that. That is an Agile anti-pattern. So what is an initial story map for this particular problem? So just in case you've forgotten, the objective that I set was that we want to provide the capability for a user to determine the status for a next day parcel. So this and I'm not expecting you to read that. I appreciate that it's very small. I'm just trying to give you the sense of it. You saw this a bit earlier on. This is my initial story map that's produced around what the product should achieve in order to meet that objective. So if we remember what I basically said when it comes to a decision modeling problem, I like to think about the horizontal as the direction of the information requirement in DMN terms. So essentially the stuff on the right, it requires the stuff further to the left. So that's what I use that horizontal for. The vertical still represents value. And then what this is showing me is that this is now what the team has agreed as the MVP in order to meet that objective. So what is it that we're going to do next? So the product owner is likely to start working with the team to refine the highest priority stories further so that they can provide an input into sprint planning. Development team are going to discuss the likely approaches to the required architecture. So they're likely to work within any architectural guidelines that already exist. In this example, I'm going to assume that executable decision modeling is part of those architectural choices. Otherwise, I'm in the wrong presentation. And someone in that team may well say, right, well, based on understanding that objective, actually, now I'm going to take a punt at an initial DRD based on that story map. So like I say, those are the possible next steps. They're pretty likely, but I want to kind of give a sense that, you know, we've got further refinement to do. We've got conversations that we're going to have. We've got stuff that's going to shape what comes next. So this is an initial DRD structured based on that story map. So this first one is actually the furthest right epic that was on that story map. So confirm current parcel status. I've created a decision called parcel status. Just the thing to call out here, I've followed the convention where I don't put spaces in the feel friendly enough expression language names that I use. I know it's not mandated that you take spaces out, and I know that a lot of people have moved to that because the business don't like it. Personally, I just prefer the way that the related logic works. When it comes to things like business readability, the fact that I'm doing all this through user stories for me is actually a better way of having the conversation about the logic. And then what I can use is the decision model to actually demonstrate that I'm meeting the acceptance criteria. So the second story in this is actually the first story broken down within that same epic. So what I've basically done, I mentioned at the start that you could split stories according to dimension data. So in this instance, I've said, I know that we are going to want to confirm the parcel status for parcels generally, but I know that what I'm going to focus on in the first instance is next day parcels. So I'm going to make my initial decision, no pun intended, that actually splits out from the parcel status something specifically focused on next day. That gives me the flexibility to build in separate decisions at a later date around standard parcels, international parcels, and any other variation. And then the third one is, again, it's another epic, but this one is to the left of the story map. So you can see I'm following my convention where I'm talking about the information requirements. So this is determine whether a parcel journey has been completed. But then I've broken that down into two further decisions that again are from the underlying user stories. So at this stage, that is my initial punt at what the logic aspects of this might look like. Jacob, can I just do a quick check on how we're doing for time?
Yes, you can. You have 5, 10, maximum 10 minutes more.
10 minutes, right? Okay, cool. Okay, decision modeling time. No, it's not. We could, and some modeling might certainly be useful and drive out questions required to get the user story to a play-ready state of planning. The story map is useful from the, sorry, I've completely skipped that. we could dive straight in, but if we do that, we're still focusing on one aspect of the value of the stories. So we still need to know the boundaries of what we're working within so that we don't over or under engineer what it is we're trying to do. So at this point, the risk is we could then take all of that stuff, good stuff that we did at a story mapping level, and we could go all waterfall style requirements with it and say, right, I'm going to absolutely go to town on my DRD and document absolutely everything. So we need to understand what the highest priority items are in the backlog, refine them to a state where they can be developed. And by developed, I'm including the build of the logic and the publication of the associated service. So what I'm going to do in terms of refining highest value user stories is the user story map's useful from the perspective of visualizing the journey. I need to refine the backlog as a product owner in terms of the value within the MVP release that we mapped in that user story. And the DRD is actually a useful place to help with that prioritization. So how do I use a DRD to support backlog prioritization? So at the top, that's actually, I'm going to class that as my highest value decision. That's the thing that ultimately the user is going to care about. And then the other stuff that I've got is I've got some critical inputs to enable my decision making. So that then means that I can prioritize this backlog. So this is now the flat view of the backlog. And you can see on the left-hand side, those horizontal swim lanes that appeared in the story map are actually versions that now appear in Jira. And I've sorted this according to value, and I've focused specifically on those stories in the scope of the MVP. So what I'm now going to do to avoid trying to tackle all of this is I'm now going to talk about focusing on the top one only, which is determining whether a next day parcel has met its target, because that is the highest value decision. And those are the highest value inputs. So this is the first pass at the user story. Some of you are going to be asking, he's going to get to a decision model any minute now. But basically, this is the thing that's actually going to facilitate the conversation about what's needed. So it's composed of a story, a description, a set of acceptance criteria, and it also talks about a little bit about what's out of scope. So the thing that I want to draw attention to is that first acceptance criteria. This is where the advantage of the user story in framing the conversation has a huge amount of value, because delivering value to the user, this first acceptance criteria may not be a decision modeling problem to solve. It might partially be, it might not be at all. But that is the benefit of having this user story, because it drives that conversation in the development team as to what they're going to do and where. So, for example, how will the information be provided by the user for this story? Are we going to build a UI? And if so, what's it going to look like? What happens if the ID isn't valid? Will that be handled by the API? You know, where's the data coming from? Can we do this independently and mock the data? There's loads of conversations that a Scrum team should be having because what they're basically trying to do as a self-managing team is work out the best way to get this stuff done. So we need to firm up the acceptance criteria a little bit more. A lot of the questions can be answered and others driven out by using a technique called specification by example. And this is where our first reference to vegetables comes in. So a technique from behavior-driven development is specification by example, and it uses gherkin scenarios to actually firm up those acceptance criteria. So it's a highly collaborative thing to do. It provides us with test cases for testing our decision model at the build stage, and it also allows us to automate tests for the application. So not only do we have something that provides us with our criteria for what our decision model needs to be able to do, but it also provides us with a technique where when we want to automate tests at the application level and potentially at the UI level as well, then we've actually got something that can do all of that for us, and it can become living documentation. So again, I'm not expecting people to go through this chapter and verse, but this is a first set of gherkin scenarios. So gherkin scenarios use a given, when, then construct. So it works a little bit like a decision table in that respect, in that each scenario represents a combination of things that must all be true, which is the given and the when, in order to reach an outcome, which is the then. So The key difference is that this is specification by example. So we use, you can see there's a couple of things here. There's at the bottom, there's a scenario, and then there's other things called scenario outlines. So a scenario outline can actually be used to test a whole combination of conditions. So if you imagine the power of that in an automated test environment, then what that means is that you could plug hundreds of thousands of values in this, and that will keep ticking over, so that if you've got automated integration as part of your build pipeline, then that will quite quickly flag where you've introduced something that's actually broken that build. So they drive out further requirements. They might not all be decision modeling related, but ensure that we've covered everything needed to realize the end user value. And the background keyword provides a way of setting up the inputs to a whole set of scenarios so that they don't have to be repeated. So specifying that highlights that certain things actually have to be true. So for example, a parcel input data has to be valid to identify it in the first place, because otherwise, how can we say that it's definitely got a parcel service category the next day, and we know that it's already received its metric entry? If it's not a valid parcel ID, we'll find nothing. So that is what that suggests. Isn't it already valid and complete? So what do we do now? So option one is we make the parcel ID a prerequisite of the scenario. So what we actually say is that we add into our Gherkin scenario that the parcel has to be valid in the first place. So we could then have conversation to say, right, we actually might add functionality into the UI to ensure a valid data entry. And we can cover that by introducing an additional acceptance criterion. So in this instance, a valid parcel ID must be provided to perform the search. So can I decision model? Yes. Congratulations. So in being able to decision model, basically, we've got this story to what's called a play ready state, which means it's been refined. We've answered all of the major questions. So for example, we are likely to want to have known how the input data is structured, so that even if we haven't sourced it for this story, we at least know what it looks like, and we can mock it up so that we can provide some test data, and we can therefore validate the logic. Sorry, I've just skipped past that. So we're also going to have broken that down into subtasks through sprint planning. So what that list shows you then is a set of subtasks, and not all of those, again, are decision model related. So I'm going to keep driving that home. In order to deliver this value, we've got more than just decision modeling to do. So first draft of the decision model. So the first thing we might choose to do is actually take a punt at the data types. So it depends on the person. I actually created these data types as I went through the tool. Some may choose to say, well, do you know what, actually I want to understand all the data up front and ask all of the questions about that in order to come up with that list. So again, tools like TriTech allow you to do it either way, but that is the initial pass at the data. The first couple of them there, the raw parcel scan and the parcel pre-advice, are actually going to be input data as well, whereas the second two are interim data types, for want of a better term. So what does the first draft of the decision model looks like? Well, this is now, I've already iterated over the decision model from earlier, but this is now, in practical terms, this is, it's a little bit different from the initial architecture. That's the initial architecture there. And there's a few things that I've decided not to include at this stage, such as determining which scans count as start and endpoints. In principle, what I'm trying to do is get to a working model as soon as possible to see if the things hang together so I can tweak it. So, for example, I've mocked up a dummy input called parcel completion scan received. That's something that I would want to derive actually within the decision model. But for the time being, I just want to test that actually I can come to a conclusion about the status of that parcel based on some input data and some initial logic that I've put in between it. So this is the sample of my top level decision. So now we're actually getting into the guts of it a little bit. So this is a pretty simple decision table with a little bit of logic at the start, which takes something from one of the other decisions to actually isolate its date and time. So it's already starting to test the second and third acceptance criteria from our ticket. And that's been done pretty quickly because you can see it's a pretty simple decision. So even at this stage, I've got enough here to actually do some tests. So I've grayed out some of the data to protect the innocent. And essentially though, I've got the output in a format that I need. I've got the input or the transactional input data mapped. So basically what it means is that I can actually make changes anywhere kind of within this line here to my heart's content, because actually I've done enough to understand what the information is in these things. That means that I can then iterate over this in order to reach that one conclusion. But the first thing I've done is focused on trying to provide something of value to the user in terms of the parcel status. So the first output looks pretty good. So I've actually got something that's reflective of the logic, because the end scan date time is actually after the target date time. You can't see it in this view because it's actually part and parcel of this. So actually I've taken the end date time from here and I've looked at the latest one in there and then compared that to the target date time. So that's a good step. The only thing that might stop me from just exporting this here and now and allowing people, assuming that I'm not the one working on the UI, to do the integration work, is the fact that I've introduced this kind of dummy component. You know, whoever's doing the UI and services might say, actually, put that in here so that I'm only ever putting in the input data that we need. So the other side of the story, and pun intended in this section, the decision model is still pretty small, but there's the other subtasks to complete. So I've got to provide the input data to the decision. I've got to get the decision into a service in the first place. So in amongst all of that, we've also started working on a UI. So that's a basic UI. And then I've actually built, so that in talking about the validation, I've actually built some of that validation into the UI. I've done this in Power Apps. So essentially I'm going to enter an ID. I'm going to click on search. If it's less than 9 digits long, it's going to throw me an error. So essentially I'm only going to call that decision model with a valid parcel ID. Now, again, there's things around that validity. You know, how do you guarantee that that 8-digit number is actually still a valid ID? But that's something, again, that I would look to iterate over. And then we've got yet another side, which is the workflow and underlying data. So I've got something in Power Automate I've chosen to use for this example, where Power Apps is, when I click on search, that's actually going to trigger this flow. The first thing I'm going to do is go in and get some scan data from a spreadsheet. That's going to be the input to my decision service. So that's triggered from the UI. That's currently stored in Excel, which will return rows that match that particular parcel ID that I've applied. Now, sadly, I didn't actually have the execution environment for the decision model. Otherwise, at this point, what I'd have showed you is how you create the connection to the decision service, having exported it from the tool, and how that would then allow you to pass it back into the UI. So unfortunately, I didn't have that on this occasion, so you'll just have to use your imagination. So what is that in summary? For this story, we have done a number of things, only one of which is actually doing a decision model. So some of these I've not shown explicitly, but they're all required to provide the value articulated by the story. So we've modeled the logic and tested the model in the tool. We've exported it to the execution environment, although obviously we didn't get the chance to see that. We've built an initial UI with some basic validation. We've connected up a workflow to make the call to the decision service, if I'd been able to build the connector, and we should have returned the results of this decision service back to the application. There's still other things that we'd want to do. So we're probably going to want to build the automated tests into the application using our aforementioned Gherkin scenarios. There's a whole load of resources out there on how you actually convert that into executable specifications. And actually, I might want to do some manual testing as well. So in summary, decision modeling and execution is only one part of delivering that story. But in doing that incremental and iterative breakdown, we've delivered value to a user early and within a scalable framework for the underlying logic. So what I mean by that is we've got that input data. We might have other input data later on, but actually the majority of what was in that very first slide is reference data that theoretically could be modeled. I've modeled it as relations in that decision model. So actually I could probably get away for a certain length of time with it just being within the bounds of the decision model itself. But we've still got something scalable to iterate over it, and we can continue to build up the logic and functionality in the application and release it when it's ready. Now, when ready is a matter for debate. You could actually release something for alpha and beta testing, or you might only release it at an MVP stage. And we can refactor the logic to go through the maintainability. I was going to now talk about refactoring through business knowledge models, but I'm just conscious of time, whether I've got a couple more slides on that, Jacob, or we can move to Q&A.
Yeah, probably we should start Q&A.
Yeah,
and you can actually add later and send me this presentation, and I will publish more information.
Yep, cool, sounds good.
Will it work? Okay, thank you very much, Nick, and we will start Q&A session. Everybody can unmute themselves and talk, or you can type your questions.
Hi Nick, I've got a couple of questions.
Yeah, sure.
First of all, I'm going to say that's a really nice presentation. Lots of good ideas there, and I like the way you've approached this from the angle of Agile project management. But I was a little confused at one point about what you meant by decision modeling, because you said you were going to prioritize your user stories based on a DRD, or you had a DRD, which you showed us, and then you said, but
Yep.
Is it time to decision model? No. To my mind, a DRD is a decision model. So
yeah,
I assume you're distinguishing between some sort of a requirements model and a design model, which is more sort of implementation specific.
Yeah, that is probably, that is an absolutely fair shout. I think, I'm making the difference between yes, you're absolutely right. DRD is a decision model. And I suppose the nuance is the difference between actually making that decision model produce outcomes based on inputs, and there's the architectural aspect, which is saying, right, what decisions might require other decisions. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It is definitely more of at that point, an architectural modeling approach. So yeah, I was thinking about, no, don't just go. I was trying to make the distinction, I suppose, between people just going, right, let's start creating box context and let's start writing field expressions and all of that kind of stuff. And it's very much still about that overarching high level thinking that kind of sets the context for then, understanding what you're doing at a lower level.
Okay, yeah, that makes total sense. So with that in mind, would you have a user story for creating the initial DRD? How do you fit that into an Agile plan? And
so,
secondly, do you see a process of changing the initial DRD into your final DRD in an Agile way, or do you just think of replacing it?
So in the first instance, what I would actually see with the DRD, so if I answer the second question first, I would almost expect that the DRD, as soon as you start it, would be the thing that you evolve. So unless you find out something fundamental, which you say, do you know what, it's going to be easier just to throw this whole thing away and start again. And I think that's the beauty of the DRD, is it allows you to do that iterative and incremental evolution of it. So for me, like if that end state decision model that I showed right at the beginning, that was built up incrementally and iteratively from something far simpler. So for me, that is a living model, and I wouldn't see the value in, the initial one, whilst it might have looked like it was maybe mocked up in Visio or something, it was actually in Tricertech. It's just I hadn't put any colors on it. So it was essentially the initial iteration of that final decision model. So I would definitely see it being something that you iterate over. In terms of creating that initial DRD, this then comes down to the debate between what is a user story and what is a task, which is definitely something that comes up if you're a Jira user. So for me, where I've the way that I would do these kind of things is the user story format definitely has value. If you want to say, well, do you know what? I want to produce a decision requirements diagram so that I understand the overarching architecture of my decision model, absolutely raise that as a story. But what you equally, you could say, well, I know that as part of envisioning the architecture, I've got some tasks that I need to do. So you might say, actually, one user story that I'm going to do is say, you know, as a Scrum team, I want to envision the overall architecture for this product so that I can make design decisions in the best possible way. Could be a way that I phrase it, and then subtasks within that could be create a DRD, create an Archimate model of the architecture, create, I don't know, an Azure, you know, whatever that, I can't remember, like other architecture diagrams, basically things that artifacts that have value in supporting the ongoing process of delivery.
Okay, thanks, Nick.
More questions? Denis?
Actually, I was just interested in seeing your slides about refactoring in BKM. So,
okay,
my question is that
I can definitely do that.
How
yeah,
we do refactoring to BKM?
Let me just do that then. So hopefully everybody can see my screen again.
Yep.
So if I actually go to here, I'll go from current slide. So we went through all of this. Okay, BKMs for refactoring. So this is a snapshot from the again from the end state decision model, and this is where, so refactoring in engineering terms usually means restructuring the existing code without changing its external behavior. So, excuse me. So for me, the same concept exists in decision modeling, be that, you know, decomposition into decisions that require other decisions. But then what I realized in a later version, so this kind of supports what I said to Alan earlier on, when I was iterating over that decision model, I realized that by in determining the earliest scan for entry and the earliest scan for the ending point actually required the same logic. So rather than actually build the same calculation into the context entries for both of those decisions, I put it in a single business knowledge model. So essentially what I ended up doing was I put that into the business knowledge model, where I essentially passed in a list of scans, a list of tracking points that tell me which scans are relevant. And then from that, I said, okay, bring me back all of the applicable scans and then find me the earliest one of those and then return that earliest scan for me. So that was the logic. And then in the BKMs, in the invoking decisions, these are basically the two invoking decisions. So the first one is the earliest one, and the second one is the end one. So the first one, its only logic is invoking that business knowledge model, and it's basically passing into it the things that it cares about. Now, in the second one, it's also doing the earliest scan. In this particular screenshot, you'll see that there's not particularly any difference between the two. And that's because this is based on the early version of the model, not the latest version of the model. So that's essentially, no, sorry, I'm talking rubbish. The difference between the two actually is in the data passed through for applicable tracking points. So I'm still passing through all of the parcel scan data because the parcel scan data is the parcel scan data. In the first instance, what I'm passing through is my constraint is the entry tracking points, and the second one is the end tracking points. So essentially what that calculation is then doing is it's saying, bring me back the earliest scan for scans that are within the entry tracking point group, and in the second one, bring me the earliest scan of those scans that are in the end tracking point group. So that's basically what I would consider that to be refactoring using business knowledge models. So hopefully, Denis, that answers your question.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. And that is very good advice there.
Cool.
Okay. More questions? You almost don't have time. Can I ask you a generic question? Being a practitioner, you can see changes in our customer base. For example, many people with whom I talk mention that while we manage to migrate logic to hands of business analysts, we can see more and more programmers actually using decision modeling. And a lot of professional programmers, especially when they migrate from legacy system, prefer to use DMN or DMN-like tools. Do you see the same trend?
Yeah, definitely, and I think so. For me, this is where the beauty of some of the Scrum practices come into it, because it's essentially saying you pick the right tool for the job. So if you've got somebody with those skills and you've done all of the necessary discussions that say what is the appropriate tools for this. Now, granted, you've got to have the awareness of decision modeling in the first place, but I would expect somebody to say, right, well, actually, yeah, this particular problem that we're trying to solve is ripe for the use of decision modeling. You know, if it's a logic problem, that should be one of the first ports of call. Now, ultimately, any organization will need some sort of cognizance of it as a technique, but I would definitely see it being used more readily, because ultimately, a lot of the syntax in Feel, some of it reminds me of a very brief flirtation with, some of the constructs in JavaScript. Bruce Silver's, often mentioned the idea that actually using a language like Feel's no different to using Excel. And I really like that kind of explanation in terms of trying to drive buy-in for people, because where you get that typical, it's not friendly enough. I think if you put it in the context of, the kind of the mad skills that some Excel users have got, then it isn't a huge leap. But that is where I kind of, I suppose, look then towards some of the practices around, how we document acceptance criteria and Agile and those kind of Gherkin scenarios, to say, well, actually, you've still got approaches for, boiling it down to true human readable logic by you. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, even Gherkin scenarios get a little bit programmatic. But yeah, I think I would definitely see that happening a lot more.
Okay, we're almost out of time. Last question, if you have. Okay, let me thank you, Nick, for a very serious and thoughtful presentation. And I hope to see all of you next month on April 7. And it will be a presentation with quite intriguing name. And I posted it on our chat board. Thank you very much, everybody, and see you next time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Great job, Nick. It was very nice.